Hello and welcome back to the conversation here, breaking the consensus at Protect Life. Before we start, I'd like to ask you if you can just click the subscribe button there so we can keep you up to date on any new videos or any new information, new articles that we have working. Also, as you know, we're facing a number of challenges at the moment and we're working hard and campaigning hard on those. And to do that, we need your help. So as you can see, there's a donate button there. Any little thing at all that anybody can give would be most appreciated, and I can tell you will be used. Every penny will be used to further the causes that we care about. But today I am delighted to be joined by Ferdi McDermott, and Ferdi is we'll just call him an educationalist and a bit of a pioneer. So Ferdi, could you introduce yourself a little bit to the people and to explain about who you are, where you're from, that kind of a bit of your own background, so we understand where you're coming from a bit.
Sure, Michael. Well, thank you first of all, thank you very much for inviting me onto the program. We can call it that. And as you can hear, I'm an Englishman, but I'm also an Irishman. Is that allowed?
That's allowed. That lots and lots of people like that.
And also, I'm living now in France. And I suppose, in a way, that there's a kind of a Bermuda Triangle of the church and education between those three countries, going back at least to St. Patrick. In fact, over the history of education, the destinies of England and France and Ireland have been very much tied together, whether it's Charlemagne inviting Irish monks over to start a school in Paris and confiding one of his sons to the Irish monks, or whether it's St. Patrick getting his priestly formation in who was probably an Englishman, or at least a Romano-Celt from Wales or something, getting his formation in France and then going back to Ireland when he was an old man to convert the Irish. These three nations have had a close association, of course, particularly with the Reformation, all sorts of Irish and English educational establishments set up in France. But my background is that I grew up in Southampton, the south of England, and I went to an Anglican school for my secondary education, one that was founded under King Edward VI in the 16th century, after the time when the chantry schools and many religious schools were closed down in the 1540s. And King Edward VI was petitioned to allow new schools to start up again. And so I had a kind of very Anglican education, but a Catholic family. Grew up on a little farm in Hampshire, close to nature, with parents who were, I suppose you might say, if you're familiar with Rod Dreher's book, The Benedict Option, they were kind of in that way of thinking about modern life, that we needed to go back to traditional ways, be closer to nature and be self-sufficient, and great respect for learning. We banished the TV for most of my upbringing and that kind of thing. And then after that, I went to Edinburgh University and read Celtic studies and French and Scandinavian as well. So yeah, so I was actually very much caught up in this kind of Bermuda Triangle between the, if you like, the Angles and the Saxons, and also the Vikings, and the French and the Irish, and lots of medieval monks in all the sort of things I was studying there at university. And then after university, I applied for the priesthood for the Diocese of Portsmouth. That would have been in 1995. And started in 1995 a pastoral placement in a parish with a view to going off to the seminary after that. I think they thought I was a bit too hot to handle, so they thought, well, we'll let him cool down in a parish before we send him to the seminary. And at the same time, as a mark of how much of a firebrand I was, I was starting with a couple of friends a magazine for Catholic schools, because I suppose you might say, I went to a school that I thought was a good school and I enjoyed it. And I also enjoyed the way.
Could you speak to that?
Yeah, but
what was your experience you would have been in the school in school in the 80s, in secondary school in the
I
80s.
was
Is
at
that right?
school in the 80s. That's right. Yes, I was at school
What
in
was
the
your
80s
experience
until.
of that? What was the pedagogy like? What was the curriculum like?
Well,
Traditional.
yeah, I mean, well, it was the end of the O-level system, and the O-levels in Britain, it was the first year of GCSE when I took GCSEs. So the school that I was in hadn't really changed the basic teaching since the 50s, really. So there was we were taught Latin and history in a chronological manner, languages starting with the grammar, very good mathematical teaching. So we were finished where other schools would take their O-levels at 16 in maths. Most of the boys would take them at 15. High percentage of boys being given unconditional offers to Oxford and Cambridge.
Okay.
It was a good, solid academic school. And also it was a school where I would say probably unusually for the late 1980s, where we had a headmaster who was very keen that practically all of our teachers were practicing Christians of some kind, and they talked about it frequently.
So in a sense, it called itself an Anglican school. It was an Anglican school.
It was an Anglican school, yes. An Anglican private school, a kind of a survival of the grammar schools of the 16th century.
In practice, so, not just in name.
Yeah, in practice too. So, I mean, we had religious assemblies, which in England at the time and still are obligatory every day in state schools. But the private schools, of course, aren't bound by that kind of law. But, you know, with plenty of hymns, plenty of Anglican worship. There were 1,000 boys in the school. We had a Catholic chaplain as well. We used to talk about football with him. And good Bible RE, plenty of very solid formation in scripture, extremely pro-life school. You imagine that 1,000 boys in the school in the 1980s. I remember we were shown as part of the religious education curriculum that famous film with Dr. Bernard Nathanson, The Silent Scream.
Yes.
We took a poll of when I was 15 or 16, and all of the boys in the year, practically about 125 boys in the year, they all said, we're against abortion. And our teacher said, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to go up to the general hospital with a picket? And we argued about it and didn't do anything of the kind. And I remember when I was between the ages of 16 and 18, the headmaster giving us a talk about the sanctity of marriage and waiting till you were married before you had sex, and how marriage, was like a good wine that improved with time and all this kind of thing. So although it was an Anglican school, it was a school that was very much, and I would say, of the pupils in the school, there would only be a minority who would be practicing any religion. But the school itself, despite that question of the makeup of the pupils, the school itself was quite confident in its message and its mission. And I compared that with my sister's experience, because my sister was in a Catholic school nearby, and it wasn't the same experience there. The leadership was losing confidence in the mission of the school, and that was clear in various ways. And I can remember when I went back to my school after graduating from Edinburgh, and I visited one of my favourite teachers, who was himself a convert to Catholicism, and he said to me, he said, I hope when you go into the priesthood, he said, I hope you can do something about education. I said, well, I'll try. And in fact, I already am, because I've started this magazine for Catholic schools. And because that was the beginnings of desktop publishing in 1995. One was able to do these things over the early days of the internet. So he said, for example, my daughter, he said, who was in a Catholic school for 11 years, from the age of 5 to the age of 16. I was talking to her the other day, he said, and she didn't know what the Immaculate Conception was. And so, we talked about that. He said that was one of those things that when I was converting to Catholicism, I had to struggle with the Immaculate Conception, with transubstantiation, with papal infallibility. These are the standard things that, we had to kind of grapple with to decide whether or not we believed in them. And he said, you would have thought with over a decade of Catholic religious education lessons, my daughter would have been taught something, but she didn't seem to have studied it at all. So, what I did then, I spoke to my friend who was the head boy of the local Catholic secondary school. And, he had the same experience. He was very surprised. He said, oh, the Immaculate Conception. Oh, yes, that's the virgin birth, isn't it, where Jesus doesn't have an earthly father. I said, no, that's the virgin birth. The Immaculate Conception is something different. Yeah. And I explained it to him, and he said, oh yeah, I suppose, yeah. Oh, okay, that's like on the miraculous medal, isn't it? Yeah. It wasn't something he learned at school, but he remembered the miraculous medal. And then I asked another young lady who'd been to a Catholic school, same story. I asked my dad, and he was in charge of the RCIA in our parish. And he himself was a convert. He was confirmed a Catholic, received as a Catholic when I was 12. And he said, oh, yes, the Immaculate Conception. That's how we know that Jesus was God, because of the virgin birth. And I said, no. I explained it to him, Our Lady being without original sin. And he said, oh, do we have to believe that then? And I said, well, you should know. You're teaching all these converts. And I said, yes, we do. He said, oh, okay, well, fair enough. Then I told the bishop. I told the story to the bishop, because I was seeing the bishop about becoming a priest. And the bishop, of course, was, well, I mean, thankfully, he knew what the Immaculate Conception was, so that was good.
Yes, that is good.
He certainly admitted there was a big problem in Catholic schools. So anyway, it didn't work out with the priesthood then. I sort of walked out of my pastoral placement after a few weeks and concentrated on this magazine for Catholic schools, which probably wouldn't have taken over my life as a theme, except because of that chain of events. And so then my first idea was, I'm just going to make it my mission that in a small way, sending out this magazine, which was backed by advertising from suppliers of chairs and blackboards and what have you, that we'll have a magazine that would, gently but firmly put forward the idea of, orthodoxy and, what Catholic schools are meant to be, shop windows of the Christian life, where they're real communities of prayer, all that sort of thing. And I would just do that, but of course I couldn't make a living out of that. And I thought, well, as I'm publishing one thing, I may as well publish other things. So I started a little publishing company that lasted for 7 or 8 years called the St. Austin Press. And we've expanded slowly, publishing different Catholic books. But all the time, this magazine was going out there for Catholic schools. And after a couple of years, rather than editing it myself, which was a bit of a confidence trick because I wasn't really qualified to edit such a magazine, I got a recently retired headmaster to take over as the editor, and he did very well. His name was Eric Hester, and from the north of England. He had in Altrincham in Cheshire, he ran a school there, Christian Brothers School, which he became head of. And so, this magazine was going out to about 3,000 schools, creating some waves. People were saying, who is this? Who is this man? Why has he started this magazine?
Yeah, I'm just curious, did you get any pushback? If you're, I'm speculating in my head, I can imagine, shall we say, the kind of, shall we say, position that such a magazine would be. Do you get any negative responses, any hostility from the schools, from teachers?
Yes, yes. I mean, we had a letters page, and some people wrote nasty letters. But I think people were confused because the magazine looked official. I mean, it had lots of color. It was very beautifully printed. It had lots of people in it. I mean, occasionally there were bishops writing for it, and and I think a lot of people were confused. Was this some new official line that was coming out? The biggest pushback we got was after about 5 years. We tried to get the schools to. We've been sending it out free. We invited the schools to subscribe to the magazine.
Oh,
Said,
money.
look, we've been getting this free. Now, would you like to pay £20 a year for it?
Okay.
And then a lot of schools, well, I say a lot, about 100 schools wrote back. About 1,500 schools said, yes, we would, and they paid the £20. But about 100 schools wrote back and said, no, we would not. And we never asked for it in the first place.
So can we just roll back for a moment, because this is I'm curious. You're obviously talking about the experience of Catholic schools in England, but one of
there
the
are
things
about 3,500 in England, Wales, and Scotland that we used to send the magazine to.
A friend of mine, very sadly recently gone to God, was the governor of a Catholic school in Essex, in Rayleigh in Essex, and we would talk about his experiences there. He'd gone there. He's former seminarian. And it often struck me that in some ways that Catholic schools in England had a capacity to demand more Catholicism from their schools than Irish schools. But I think that a lot of us here are
I think that's true. I think that's true, Michael, because theoretically in England, the state doesn't really understand Catholic schools, but the state just pays for them in the state sector and lets the Catholic bishops tell them what they want to do. So at various points, the Catholic bishops have either gone the right way or gone the wrong way. I mean, because the politicians are quite happy for the Catholic bishops to say, no way, Jose, we're not going to do that. And they would always give the Catholic schools a pass on, for example, sex education and different issues like that, and accept that the Catholics do things in their own way. But sometimes the Catholic bishops haven't fully taken advantage of that leeway that they have. But they do have a massive amount of leeway. So the Catholic schools in England could be extremely faithful to their mission and yet financed by the state. So that, and there isn't the anti-clericalism in England that we have, that you perhaps have in Ireland.
This is a question that I think puzzles a lot of people. I went to Loretto Nuns Christian Brothers from the age of 3 till 17. And the large majority of people in Ireland, until not that long ago, would have attended schools which were nominally Catholic, both at primary and secondary level. Very often there would have been either nuns, priests, or brothers. And yet, when it over the last 20 years or more, indeed, it's a little bit like the children that went through these schools were like stones in a river. They only got wet on the outside. There was that schools, was it a failure of confidence? Was it a more generalized thing in church? I was unusual. My class was unusual in primary school that we had a Christian brother who used the Christian Brothers Catechism, little red catechism. Who is God? Why did God make you? That kind of thing. But I can say, for example, and I went to school in the 80s, contrary to what people would say, I never heard abortion discussed at all, or the morality or church moral teaching, except by one teacher. He was an English teacher who had worked in England. He taught English. He was Irish. Who'd worked in England as hospital porter, had seen the results of abortion, had been horrified by it, and had spoken to us about his personal experience. But at the level of a kind of catechesis or RE, generations went by completely unprepared for any kind of discourse or engagement with a hostile world. Do you have any sense? What was going on there?
Well, I chime with that. I mean, because that corresponds to my experience. I mean, I would say, from my experience, that in England, that was the way things were in the 80s, that Catholic schools were treading on eggshells on these issues. They didn't have to be, but they That was just the way it went. I had a unique experience in the school I was at that was a kind of a believing school and very pro-life institutionally. But when I got to Edinburgh, I discovered that the students there, for example, who were active in pro-life circles, and Edinburgh is a university where most of the students seemed to be English at the time, but including in the Catholic chaplaincy. But when it came to pro-life work, because I was involved in the pro-life society in the university there, they were all young Scottish Catholics who'd been through the Scottish Catholic school system. So my impression was that the Catholicism as taught in Catholic schools in Scotland was more traditional, but that's perhaps because Scotland was a little bit like Northern Ireland. There's a more sort of tribal sense of we're Catholics, we're proud of being Catholics, and we're going to teach our religion come hell or high water. Whereas in England, Catholics were more kind of in bed with the establishment, and they didn't want to upset anybody. So, but I think probably now it's lowest common denominator everywhere. I mean, there are signs of renewal. There are people in their 20s, 30s now. I would say most of the young men going for the priesthood, any young women going for religious life, any kind of young Catholic intellectuals such as they're all more on the faithful conservative side, I would say. So at some point, there's going to be a shake-up. I'm not quite sure if it's going to be soon or not, but the fact that our institutions, which are difficult to change, institutions of Catholic education, whether in England or in Ireland, it's so difficult to change them because there are people in place and there are mentalities and structures you can't hack away at. They're finding it increasingly difficult to find people to run these structures. And so you get some dioceses, for example, where they're kind of going conservative. That's happening in England. And maybe that will happen elsewhere. I mean, in Britain, there were signs of it. About the time I was running this education magazine, about the time I started the school here, just before the year 2000, there were signs in the private sector in the UK that the Benedictines, particularly Ampleforth, Downside, those sort of schools, that they were going to swim against the tide and stand up for their Catholic ethos and teach not just Christian values, but Christian faith. Because anybody can have values. I mean, non-Christians might have good values. Let's not pretend that they're not good people and we're not capable of being good people. But there was a real sign that Catholic schools in the independent sector were saying this is what makes us unique, is our faith. And I remember talking to Don Anthony Such, who was the headmaster of Downside at the time in the 90s. And that was very much his vision. He was kind of, going to swim against the tide. Fortunately, he had a bit of a fall from grace subsequently. And the same thing happened in other schools, that the monks and the priests who had that kind of instinct, who seemed to be leading that charge. I mean, I remember, for example, when I was dealing with the heads of Catholic schools in this magazine, the independent heads were very sympathetic to my agenda, whereas the state Catholic heads were a bit confused about what was happening.
So you're running this.
I would say that what happened in England was the child abuse scandal that has kind of completely knocked the confidence out of that sort of embryonic revival that was poised to happen at the end of the 1990s, beginning of you might call it the Benedict XVI generation, as it turned out to be. John Paul II, Benedict XVI. Didn't happen. It didn't happen because of the child abuse.
Yeah. So just going to. You're running this magazine. It's going okay, and then for some kind of bizarre, you get this bizarre notion that you're going to set up a school. Where did this come from? So, two questions. Why did you do such an odd thing? And secondly, how do you end up in France? No, it seems to me that an Irish Englishman living in France has made a very sensible choice. But anyway, other than that, how does that happen? Why? How did you get this notion? Why did you think you could possibly succeed? And then why do you end up in France?
Okay, well, I'll take those questions one at a time. Why did I have the idea I wanted to set up a school at all?
Yeah.
Well, it was a certain sense of a little bit of frustration, but also kind of growing interest in the subject through this magazine that we're doing. But also the fact that there seems to be a lot of younger teachers in their sort of 30-something, late 20-something, 30-something teachers who were writing to me and saying, look, you've got a network of all these teachers who are contributing to your magazine. It's called Mentor, incidentally. Why don't we start a school? Why don't we start a school that actually puts this vision into practice? And so in the end, that's what I did. And in fact, a couple of the teachers who helped start up the school in the first year were contributors to the magazine. And one of them was a retired Christian brother who was only about 60,
Right.
and full of energy. And he was with us for the first 7 years, an Australian, but with an Irish passport. And so, well, why did we go to France? Well, you know, we were looking around the south of England and there were two problems. First of all, at the time, I was able to find Catholic bishops who were quite happy to write me a letter saying, Ferdi McDermott's a great man and it would be very good for him to start a school in France. We recommend him. But they weren't prepared to have me in their own diocese. So I think they wrote me that I got a few letters like that just to get rid of me, you see. So that was one thing. There was the ecclesiastical side. And the second one was that in England, there were no big kind of, how can I put it, appropriate properties with a chapel and classrooms and bit of land and all that sort of thing that you would need for a school to be having a fairly ambitious plan for the future, that were available in the UK that either a bishop might let you use or some other institution might let you use or sell to you. And if you were going to buy such an institution, they'd be so expensive, 10 times the price in the south of England. We could have done it in the north of England, but or Wales or possibly Ireland. Ireland was already becoming expensive. So as it happened at the time, a lot of English people were going to France. You know, they were selling their little house in the south of England and buying a big one in France. You know, there was a movement of that, leaving the rat race. So in fact, and also, you know, a couple of the teachers in the school came from Zimbabwe. And another one was from Ireland, another one was from Australia. There was no particular link to England, although, you know, half of us were English, half of us were not. So just a few of those factors coming together, really, and the fact that I spoke French because I was good at French at school and I studied at university with those other languages. I thought, well, let's have a look in France and see what's happening down there. And sure enough, it turned out that there were bishops in France who had big monasteries and abbeys and convents and seminaries that were empty. And the French bishops, the attitude of the French bishops even then was, if you want to start something up, we'll support you, even if we're not 100% on your wavelength. We think it's great that you want to do something. Whereas the English bishops at the time were very suspicious of anything that wasn't within the diocesan structures.
So, okay, can I ask you then, what is Ferdi McDermott's conception of a Catholic school? What does that mean?
Right. Okay, well, I'd say we would take our blueprint from if you want a mission statement, we take our blueprint from Gravissima Educationis, which is the Vatican II's document on Catholic education. And there are 4 kind of key points that come out of that. If you sit down with pen and paper and make notes of what are the key points, there's lots of verbiage, but what are the key points? And it's a broad education. So Catholic education should be broad. It shouldn't just be like a madrasa teaching religious doctrine. It should be a broad education, and that should be a hallmark of a Catholic school. And it should be a deep education, So it shouldn't just be superficial magazine knowledge. You should be getting to grips with, for example, grammar in a language or whatever. And the next thing is that it suggests that perhaps in the past there had been the idea that, we want people to do good, and that, we want Catholic children to make sure they're good after they've left school. But in this document, it says that they should be able to choose good. And for that, they need a moral formation. And it suggests that this is particularly important in the modern world, because perhaps people won't be acting collectively, but individually, which has turned out to be true. And then the fourth thing, after the broad education, the deep education, moral formation, the fourth thing is a formation in prayer, and specifically a formation to enable you to participate in the liturgy, in the sacred liturgy. Right? So those are the four hallmarks of the Catholic school. Now, I would say that probably the academic concerns have tended to trump the other concerns, but in some places, even those academic concerns have taken a nosedive. And where does this blueprint come from? Well, I would say this blueprint is actually very old. If you look at the first Catholic school that ever existed that we know about, it was in Alexandria in the 2nd century, before the Peace of Constantine, before the Roman Empire became a Christian empire, in Egypt. So, the Catholic school came out of Africa, if you like. In Egypt, Clement of Alexandria, who was working in the Great Library of Alexandria, this massive depository of centuries of learning, biggest that there was in the world at that time. This is the time of Eusebius and church fathers like that. He ran a school that taught what a lot of your listeners will know as the trivium and the quadrivium. So they taught the language arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and then the kind of fullness of learning as they saw it: mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, music, so on, astronomy. To boys, whether or not they were going to be priests, it was just the Christian community was able to send boys to this school, and at the heart of their daily life was the liturgy, which wasn't a mass, because they had the mass maybe once or twice a week, but they had psalms and vespers and laws and all this sort of stuff. And their whole life was to do with a moral formation. It was a great moralist, Clement of Alexandria, liturgical formation, but also a fantastic, broad and deep intellectual formation, very much in continuity of what the Athenians taught, Plato's kind of ideas about education, and Socrates, that education should be about freeing the spirit and making you capable of thinking, of philosophy. That would be the kind of their aim of philosophy. And in fact, in the catechetical school of Alexandria, they had this trivium and the quadrivium, and then they had philosophy, and then they had theology, which is exactly the medieval model of the trivium, the quadrivium, and then you go to university with philosophy and theology. So this was existing in the 2nd century, and that vision of education then was really, to my mind, the best education package, if you like, and it was transported around Europe by monks. That's how it was transported. So it sort of, there were monks of the Egyptian way of thinking that then they sort of bypassed Rome, but they went to Tours, to Auxerre, to Léra in France, and then eventually they get to Ireland, you see. So St. Patrick, this is the sort of monasticism he's got. And the schools that you get in Ireland after St. Patrick's time, although they're taking on some aspects of the Druidic schools that existed before, which could shock people, but this is because St. Patrick was someone who'd experienced Irish culture from the inside as a youth. So when he comes back as a man, he's kind of respectful of it. But this trivium and this quadrivium, which frees the spirit and is a deep education and is a prayerful education, and it's a very high standard as well. So that Ireland then, by the time of Alfred the Great in the 800s, Ireland is the place in Europe which practically has universities. And so when Alfred the Great in the 800s in the south of England starts up his kind of drive to educate everyone, boys and girls, where does he get his Latinists? He sends to Ireland because they're the best educated. And where does Charlemagne get someone to run his school in Paris? Ireland. He gets an Irishman to run his school in Paris called Clement, and he gets a man from Yorkshire, Alcuin, to run his school in Aachen.
I know you're aware of the story of, I think it was a Charles the Bald, or Pepin. Anyway, one of the Charlemagne's, and there was an Irish monk who had the reputation for being a drinker, although he, as did the king. Famously, the king said to him in Latin, "What separates a sot from a Scot?" And the monk replied, "This table, Your Majesty. Tantum mensum, this table, Your Majesty." But okay, Eddie, so this is I understand your vision, and it's an ancient and deep-rooted Catholic idea. You brought this to fruition. So can you, what's your experience been? I mean, you've been there for how many years now? How is it going? How is it, in a sense, what has surprised you about it? What has the experience been so far? How many boys do you have? What's going on? Where are you? If anybody wants to apply.
We started at 10 boys in 2002, right? And 10 teachers. And last year we got up to 47, so that's the most we've had. Most of the time it's been around the 30 mark or the 35 mark. Unfortunately, this year we've been decimated by COVID,
of course,
because we have an international constituency. So, I mean, I'll give you the example of one email I was dealing with this morning. It's a father who's only this week got a visa appointment for his son, who was with us last year, an American, but he's not able to return because he can't get a renewal of the visa. So we might see him after Christmas, and we're teaching him over the internet. But apart from him, we've lost other Americans, we've lost Africans, we lost even Spaniards, because at the time when they were making their plans for September, the Spanish border was closed with France. Okay. So we're now in a situation we've gone down to 17 pupils. It looks like we might have another 5 returning in January. So we're kind of going up again slowly. But we have had, several boys who've been here the whole 7 years, all the way from 11 to 18. Mostly we pick them up when they're about 13 or 14. The school has become very much a kind of melting pot now, a kind of Anglo-French. The boys take exams from both systems, which is difficult academically, but we manage it, and we've had a good rate of success, and plenty of a stream of boys who've gone to Oxford and Cambridge and other sort of interesting, reputable places. Yeah, I'd say we've been welcomed by the French, who don't really understand us, so they just say, well, we'll let them get on with it. So in some ways, we probably have a freer hand here than we would have were we running this school in England or in Ireland. I didn't know that when we started. But that's the way it's turned out. I'd say we've, there's no kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It's a bit like weeding a garden. You can't say, I've finished. No. So what we've set out to achieve is what we're doing at the moment, and we're still doing it. But certainly the idea of having an education where the worship of God is not just at the heart of the school project, but at the heart of the school day, has worked. That works. Sorry?
Would you say, is your approach to teaching, the pedagogy, a traditional approach, more than the sort of in the desk facing forward, or this idea of, is it what is the phrase they use? Guide by the side, or the teacher? Do you believe that you have to teach children, or is it a question of letting the children discover themselves?
Well, I think probably it would be wrong to say that we were, very, very traditional, because the school is small. We have such a good pupil to teacher ratio that
Yes.
means that we can, some of the methods that were kind of developed by the Christian Brothers or whatever, where they could teach 60 or 70 in a class, and we're not teaching in that way, and I don't have to
that ratio is a great luxury.
everyone's silent. Sorry?
So it's a great luxury to have that kind of pupil-teacher ratio. What you can do with that kind of ratio is fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say if we had bigger classes, we might change the way we teach. But I would say that it is very much to do with the relationship that's created between the pupils and the teachers, and the learning happens because the pupils want to please the teachers, and they become interested in the subject, And I think that's critical. It's not driven by excessive punishments. Hello, Michael.
Sorry. So there's a liberal arts college there nearby. Is that right? Do you have a connection?
Well, a few years ago, we did actually start a liberal arts college. It's still going, but at the moment, it doesn't have any students because of COVID. We recruited 8 Americans, and we didn't do this on our own. We had a local Catholic university that's not necessarily a liberal arts college. It's just a small Catholic university, was helping us, particularly with the French side of things and the kind of academic compliance and so on. And now we're looking to see whether we can recruit some students for September 2021, but it really depends on the COVID situation. So what's happening there is they have a liberal arts degree with French, not 3 years, but 2 years intensively, and they get a bachelor's degree at the end. But it's just a similar kind of teaching model, classes of 3 or 4, much more teaching than you would get in a British university, and residential. So we can't really do it without the possibility of people traveling to be here. Although we did have a couple of students who had to finish their course. It's cut short in March. Their course didn't finish until the end of September. So they had to be taught over the internet, but that wasn't ideal. We wouldn't do it again. So
I'm aware of the time, and I know you have pressures. So just before we finish up, just one last question, briefly.
Yeah.
You're interested in producing rounded human beings, or helping the production rounded in spiritually, intellectually, physically. That's the whole package, is it, as it were?
That's right. Yeah.
Do you see that, in a sense, what you're in the process of producing young men who will be in change makers? Is that part of what you hope to do?
Yes, absolutely. And that's going back to Gravissimum Educationis. One of the things it says there is that the aim is that the Catholics should be at the forefront of every discipline and every sector of life. That Catholics shouldn't accept the idea that their education is going to be substandard and they're going to be behind everyone else. They should be, they should be the leaven and the loaf. And the leaven and the loaf is what gives, the growth. And I've seen it already. We've had, in terms of the church, over 18 years here, we've had, I think, a vocation every year, not just from pupils, but also teachers. So there are already a few priests out there who are former Chavagnes men, and a few in the pipeline.
Mm-hmm.
And we've also had some young men who are now rising to positions of prominence in the military in the UK and in France, a few lawyers. So I hope, yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I hope. And I think that should be the ambition of every Catholic school, whatever kind of construction it is, that the people that they're training are going to make a difference. And it's so that it's not just about the next life. Of course, you know, it is about the next life, but it's also about this life, that the common good. This is something that Pius XI says in his encyclical for Catholic education, Divini Ilius Magistri. He says that the main purpose of Catholic education is to produce good citizens. You know,
Okay,
so it's for the common good.
Okay, listen, my degrees are in history and philosophy. I'll be sending my CV on. I think I fancy it at the time. I'd like to thank you for taking this time. I think it's been fascinating. I'll ask Adrian to include a link to the school so people can maybe find out a bit more about the school, where it is, and if anybody's interested, maybe they have in taking up your services. I'd like to remind our listeners or viewers here that Professor Vincent Toomey, the Emeritus Professor of Moral Theology from St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, will be joining us in a webinar next Wednesday week. You can get the dates on that on the Facebook page. Again, I'd invite you to subscribe and to donate if you can. And so, thank you, Ferdi. It's been fascinating, and maybe we'll talk again on something else. Keep safe, and I hope everybody stays well out there.
Okay, Cara Mina Mahagath, agus Banach Jalef. Yeah.
Slán.
Bye.